Hello, everyone, and welcome to Musing, music for the adventurous listener here on CJSW 90.9 FM in Calgary and on all your favorite podcast platforms. I'm your host, Janna Sailor. Thank you for joining me for this hour of conversation, listening, and discovery. Today on Musing, we welcome Allan Gordon Bell, Juno Award-winning composer, member of the Order of Canada, and a lifelong contributor to Canadian music. His work has resonated across concert halls and classrooms alike, marked by clarity, depth, and a profound sense of time and listening. Most recently, he was honored with a Violet Archer Lifetime Achievement Award from the Canadian Music Centre Prairie Region, recognizing a career of enduring artistic and cultural impact. Hello, Allan. Thank you so much for joining me on Musing today. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be with you.
So, for folks that are perhaps just discovering your work, how do you describe yourself as a composer and a creative?
I think that the best thing to do is to listen to the music. And if I have to introduce myself, if I were teaching a Canadian music course and I were looking at me as from an objective point of view, which is impossible, I would say that the thing that runs through my music in some way, shape, or form is the sound world, the soundscape, the orages, as I call them, that arise from this particular landscape. It's been for a very long time, and that by that I mean of Western Canada, essentially, although some pieces have arisen from voyages to other places. But it's my realization fairly early on, but as a result of a kind of creative crisis, that what I was really interested in doing was capturing the beauty that surrounded me, paying very close attention to it, and discovering the music that was in it. So that means seeing the world as if it were a musical score. That doesn't mean imitating it, that just means using it as material, transforming it through, what Joyce called the smithy of my soul, so to speak, but the distilling it in some way to then communicate that particular fascination and that particular love to others with the kind of idealistic hope that as all music can have a kind of transformative role, that one of the things that might happen as a result of listening to this music is a slight transformation, perhaps a little of a subversive transformation, so that those who are listening carefully to the music might start thinking differently about their own relationship to this world. Stop seeing it as a resource and start seeing it as home. It's idealistic as all get out, considering the forces we're up against, but nonetheless, it's the tools that I have and that I was given as a gift of my particular existence to be able to do this musically.
Talk to me about your musical journey and development. And you mentioned your inspiration coming from your surroundings, but what were some other influences on you that really shaped you as a composer?
In the beginning, of course, I'm a child of the 60s and the 70s, and of course everything that was happening then was in the pop music realm. And so in my teens we formed various kinds of groups that were doing as much of sometimes cover tunes, but most of the time we were trying to just imitate those people who were doing some really experimental types of things. I didn't take it very seriously to begin with, although when we were playing we were very serious about things, but I didn't see it as a pursuit for me. I went to university thinking that I was going to be a poet, and then I thought that I would be a philosopher, and I ran into a musician who I'd seen before, and he was in a Bachelor of Music program, and he told me what he was studying. And I said, "You can study that?" And he talked about harmony, and he talked about composition and orchestration. And so I found out what the prerequisites were for that, and I began to pursue it because I was immensely curious. I found out that I knew so very little, so the learning curve was enormous, and that's what excited me. It was the hardest thing that I'd ever encountered, and in many ways I think music still remains the hardest thing that I can conceive of, trying to both talk about it but also to create with it. But that challenge was there, so I spent hours and hours in the library listening to scores and discs. And I was very fortunate to be at the University of Alberta at a time when a rather remarkable group of composers teaching. Violet Archer had been there for quite some time. She'd been alone for a while, but she had established a really remarkable program. She was joined by someone called Manis Sazonkin, who had a similar background to hers, in that he studied also with Hindemith, but he'd studied with Schoenberg as well. He'd spent some time in Los Angeles. And then Malcolm Forsyth had joined the group, and he came in from South Africa. He had, of course, wonderful classical training. He's enormously curious musical mind, and a fabulous orchestrator. So for whatever reason, I was able to convince them that I was a candidate for their master's program. They took a chance on me because I had no right. I had only had a bachelor's degree in philosophy with some music courses. Dove right in and spent some pretty hard times working with them because they were very demanding. But as a result, I gained a considerable amount of craft, which was really important for me. I left school, and then the crisis hit, because where are you going to go? There's a lot of music out there, and I knew that I wasn't going to travel to any of the big centers because it wasn't actually financially possible for me, given my responsibilities, etc. So one evening there was a party out at a lake, and I was just simply as depressed as one can get. I went for a walk, and luckily it was January evening, and luckily I looked up and I saw the hoarfrost, and I saw the light falling on the snow, and I saw the way in which the land looked, and I was immediately struck by how beautiful it was. And then the question was, who's writing music about this? And the answer was, at that time, nobody. I didn't really know about Murray Schafer and this World Soundscape project at that time. I came in contact with that a little bit later. But of course they hadn't been up into northern Alberta, so they weren't concerned with that soundscape. And that set me on the road to try and transform the craft that I had, which was very good for a certain approach to music, to now transform that craft so that I could capture the rhythms and the textures and the sonorities that are here. If you look at the paintings that took place in Canada in the middle of the 19th century, they look like the things that are, Canada looks like the English landscape. Then along comes the Group of Seven, and the reason for that is because they encountered the Impressionists. They discovered a vocabulary that allowed them. So for me, I went looking for the vocabulary that would allow me to capture what I was hearing. And that meant releasing my music in many ways from the tyranny of the bar line and the tyranny of pulse and that sort of thing. I speak of it that way, although I make use of pulse like anybody else, but that sometimes you have to release from it. Other composers were doing that. I'd heard their music, and some of them provided clues, and some of the things I just simply invented, and found performers who were willing to go with me on that and refined that as a result of their input. So it continues, and so I'm a schizophonic composer, one who has I guess you'd call it a neoclassic background, but who's also very much involved with the orages that surround us.
Can you talk to me more about maybe the practical aspect of composing and your actual process? How do you go about taking these kind of ethereal concepts and experiences and putting them and distilling them into music and onto those bylines, and then ultimately into someone else's spirit and creative impulse?
Well, there is a part of the process that's continuous, which is whenever I encounter a sound that's of interest to me, I do my best to remember it. This is why I use the term orage, which is something I made up because I was tired of people talking about sonic images. These things are actually in our minds. We can hear in our minds, and so we don't have to call them images because that has to do with the eye. So I just invented the term orage, right? And oral, as in A-U-R. At any rate, I basically capture those. I try to remember them so that they sit inside for a bit. I transcribe them, which means, of course, it's a kind of process of trying to capture the contour, trying to capture the grit of the rhythm, the nature of the rhythm, how that goes, how it operates through time. That transcription is pretty broad in terms of, looks like scribbles to begin with. And then it gets transformed into some kind of pitch language. And that is, again, what I call a transcription, because it's not the sound itself is what it is. But Olivier Messiaen, all of his birds sing in his modes. So it's the same kind of thing, that these things get transcribed into the kinds of harmonies and melodic gestures and rhythmic gestures that I think are coherent, and then also in some way hopefully continue to evoke the sound that I'm trying to capture. Those are small ideas, and when those small ideas are the starting point, just the starting point, and then the thing has to become essentially musical. So that means exploring what that idea can do musically. So that means asking as many questions as I possibly can about that particular idea. And the idea gets transformed, because starts out being pretty banal, and hopefully it starts to take on a little bit of radiance or whatever that starts to fascinate me a little bit more, so that I hope that it will fascinate a listener too. And once you work with them, you start to discover what they can do, and then the next stage is to try and conceive of the frame into which that idea will find a proper context. So then what's it going to need? Is it going to have some contrast? What are its ultimate destinations? How's it going to work? What's its function going to be at any given time, the idea? So am I exposing it to people, or that's the first thing that they hear? Or is it reaching its culmination at some point, right? So there are all kinds of technical things I could talk about, which I would do with my students, as to how to make that work. But essentially then the idea is to make every moment of music sound as if it arose from the last moment of music, and so that it will also speak to the music inside of itself. Like musical time is like a spiral. When we listen to the moment, but we bury that, all of us listeners bury that into our memories, so that when we hear the next moment, we form a relationship. And then that relationship actually projects itself into the future. And you can say, okay, yeah, I can see where that's going. And the delight is twofold. Sometimes when the idea reaches the place where we think it's going, we feel a kind of, that's pretty cool. And then sometimes it heads on, it goes towards where we're thinking, and then surprises us and goes someplace else. And that's even cooler, because then after a little while it seems, oh yeah, that's obvious. It's done exactly what it should have done, but I couldn't figure that. I've never expected that. Which is mainly, for me as a listener, what I look for. I don't look for music that I can actually, after hearing a couple of bars, I can project what's going to happen in 3 minutes' time. Which is unfortunately why I'm not very much interested in what I hear in the popular realm these days, because pretty much I can guarantee that I know what's going to take place because of the formulaic nature of it, and I'm not looking for formulas. You understand conventions because you have to understand what listeners expect. That when an idea is presented, that's the idea that the piece is about, for example. Present an idea and then abandon it, and then because pretty soon listeners are going to become pretty bored with what you're doing. Yeah. So then after that's done, that's all a whole pile of sketching, then there's polish. And the polish comes into the recognition that, in actual fact, this music has to pass through the bodies of the performers. And so they have to understand exactly what it is that I'm doing. And so I have to make that as clear as possible to them. At the same time, I recognize that all I'm doing is building a kind of frame, so I tell them what is musical, so that they also have a certain freedom, because I hope that they get excited about the music, because I'm dependent upon them to bring their imaginations to bear, because every one of them, no matter how skilled or what level the performer is at, whether it's a high school band or it's a symphony orchestra, the musician is not just that instrument. The musician is the body and soul of the person who's playing. And if that soul, so to speak, doesn't get blown into the instrument or drawn across the bow, the music comes off as being really mezzo forte, so to speak, in the middle. Doesn't have that quality, doesn't have the life. So I prepare a kind of, we call it a score, the markings, but the music doesn't happen until the performers give life. So that's one of my final responsibility, is to polish it so that it's absolutely clear for them where they can take it.
Can you talk to me a bit more about a healthy and productive composer-performer relationship and what kinds of things you do to consciously nourish that, whether that be through careful preparation of the score and discussions beforehand, or in the case of a commission, writing specifically for a particular ensemble or individual? Can you talk to me about some of those collaborative experiences and what you can share with us from your learnings about that?
Yeah, there's some situations where you really know the performers, and that's a wonderful thing, because you can get a sense of how certain things are going to be interesting challenges for them and certain things are going to be easy for them, so that they can breathe through the piece, right? It's not everything is going to be torturous, so to speak. Not everything is going to be on the edge of challenge. There's the ebb and flow of physical tension, so to speak. For example, working with Lanzend, who I've worked with for many years, I know these performers rather well. So for me, it's a game to say, okay, how can I challenge them this time? Because they can do anything, right? The collaboration is mostly in my realm. I don't take things to people until I've completed the score. I know that other composers share their sketches and their things with the performers. I guess I'm old school, but I also see my responsibility of bringing that material as doing my job as best I can, recognizing that it's probably a bit incomplete. Most ensembles don't like composers to be present at the first rehearsal, as you know, because it's going to be rough and they're going to start saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. I have been invited to lots of first rehearsals, and I know to keep my mouth shut, and I think that's why I get the invitation. I know when something is rough and why it's rough, and I know that I can be there, I can answer the questions that they would have. If I came for the second rehearsal, it just speeds the process up for them. Mostly what happens in terms of the working with any ensemble comes down to the notion of their interpretive role, what they have thought of. And so really fine performers can think of doing a phrase or a section in a half a dozen to a dozen different ways. And lots of these things, the differences are really subtle, but they are entirely meaningful. And some of them will take the piece in a direction that was problematic for me, and some of them will take them in a direction that's revelatory for me. And so it's a confirmation for them as to what direction to go. Particularly working with string players, but also with piano players. The subtlety with string players is always bowing. And boy, that's the lessons that they've given me with respect to how subtle the sound can be altered with respect to the placement of the bow and the speed of the bow and etc. And then with pianists, it is always pedaling. And it's not you put in a pedal mark, but there's a really subtle range of pedaling that can make the sound live, or it can make the sound overpowering, or it can make the sound die. And there's a subtlety there. All musicians bring a little something to what they do. You take a flute and you think, okay, there's a Yamaha flute, and this Yamaha flute's the same as that Yamaha flute. And to a certain extent it is, but as soon as you put a pair of lips to that and some fingers, the instrument becomes a completely different thing. Because the instrument is not just the physical thing. The instrument is the relationship between the player and the physical thing. And so there's all kinds of things that you can hear in someone's playing. And sometimes the things that they want to get rid of are the very things that become actually a little bit more interesting when you hear them. How could I bring that out a little bit more? How can I get you to do that more? A little bit more breath sound in that particular gesture, because it comes closer to what I was imagining than just a straight flute sound. That kind of thing. You just keep continuously learning from all sorts of players. One of the pieces of mine that gets performed the most is a piece for basically high school band, but it's wind ensembles all over the place play it. It's called From Chaos to the Birth of a Dancing Star. It was a commission from the Alberta Band Association, and I told the commissioner that I knew absolutely nothing about how to write for high school band, even though I'd played one when I was a kid, but that's way, way back. So they suggested that I spend a week in a school, and I did, up in Sherwood Park. And I taught all the music classes, and the kids taught me how to write for high school band, because I listened to what they did, I listened to how they played, I listened to the fact that they couldn't play in tune, because that's a long way down the road for them. So what was I going to do? Then I wrote a piece in which playing in tune was absolutely, eventually it became important, but simply the beginning of the piece, half of it, 12-note chords, and all kinds of sonorities that, in fact, it doesn't matter. And we arrived at those through an improvisatory passage when they loosened up and were willing to improvise with me in class. And we arrived at many of the textures. In fact, actually, I just basically stole some of their ideas and put them into a piece. We did one improvisation, and this harkened back to my days in philosophy, which actually are still with me. But Friedrich Nietzsche, one in Also Sprach Zarathustra, the main character is asked about the creative process, and his answer is, there must be chaos in order for there to be the birth of a dancing star. And that's actually true in terms of the physical fact of how stars are formed. Out of all this turbulence, and then gravity takes hold, and then more turbulence, and then all of a sudden we've got the star. There was the turbulence in the classroom as the kids were blowing away, and I got them to play in various kinds of rhythms, etc. And yeah.
Wow. Well, so many metaphors in that. Absolutely. I want to circle back to this image of you sitting by a frozen lake looking at the hoarfrost. How did you get from that point to winning multiple awards, Juno Awards, Western Canadian Music Awards, Order of Canada? Talk to me about that career trajectory and maybe some key turning points. And perhaps that was one of the first ones, but key doors opening along the way.
There's a part of it which has to do with my process. Because it took me almost 10 years to get to the point where I felt that I'd actually accomplished what I was setting out to do. That's not that I didn't write pieces, because I did. I wrote lots of pieces. But I didn't feel that I'd actually brought things to the place that I was seeking. To get that combination of what I call the neoclassic strain, so to speak, and then the orage strain, and get them to properly be fused in a way that satisfied me. So I worked really hard, and 90% of what I did was complete and utter failure. But I just kept pressing on. And by the way, that's still with me. 90% of what I do goes somewhere else. People are not going to listen to that. I got sketchbooks galore. I was very fortunate in two things. First of all, I got hired here at the University of Calgary as a sessional lecturer. And that gave me some financial stuff. Then I got fired because I spoke truth to power. I don't need to tell that long story, but that's what happened. And I was a freelancer for about 3 or 4 years, and that taught me an enormous amount of being able to make use of my craft and basically the commercial world, so to speak, arranging and doing the video and film scores and that kind of stuff, copying music by hand, and there weren't the engraving that's taking place now, and being very poor. There were months when I had one meal a day and I wasn't even going to be sure of that one. So I am profoundly grateful for those times because of how that shaped me. I think the aspect of poverty, so to speak, and the precariousness gave me a profound gratitude and appreciation for the privilege that is my life. I got hired back at the University of Calgary because there was a change in regime, so to speak. And two people stood up for me at that time, Bill Jordan and Ken DeLong. And I paid more in taxes than I'd earned in the previous 2 years after that. So it gives you an idea of transformation of a life, but also being in a university department where there are other composers, where there are musicologists, where there are really fine performing teachers, where there are students, and I've had lots and lots of really fine and successful students, both as composers, but also many who've gone on to performing careers and teaching careers, and some who've gone on to become lawyers and doctors. The privilege of that is being in that milieu. And also, although teaching takes up a lot of time, it also provided me with a financial background that enabled me to do non-commercial work. I was very fortunate in getting a few commissions early on that brought me to the attention of the CBC. And the CBC at that time, golden age, right? The 1980s. Every CBC place in across Canada had engineers and producers, and their job was to go out and capture concerts. And no ensemble could go on to the CBC unless they included a Canadian piece on their programming. So they either commissioned them or they brought them out, and you could listen to the CBC and you could hear what your colleagues were doing across the country. So it was a golden time to be a musician, and I got performances. I got some commissions. The most important thing for me was always the performance. Some early recordings. I was fortunate to get to the attention of both the CBC and Mario Bernardi, who was our conductor here. He'd been at the National Arts Centre and went back there. And so I got a commission to do Spirit Trail, and I got a commission to do the percussion concerto and all these things. And then eventually to do an elemental lyric, which the CPO took on its pipeline tour down to the United States. So all of those things, and then other commissions, Banff String Quartet, Esther Honen's, various other things. One thing leads to another. Essentially what happens is because of the CBC, because of the recordings, because of the performances, people became interested in my music. Performers became interested in my music, and it's available through the Canadian Music Centre. I spent time as on the board of directors. I was the president for 84 to 88 and 2006 to 2010. So it was my way of giving back to the organization that was doing so much really fine work on behalf of composers. There was no other way for people to get a hold of our materials in any way, shape, or form, because there were no websites around at that time. And of course, the formation of the Canadian Music Centre here in Calgary really led to an explosion of performers and educators becoming more and more interested in Canadian music in general. I was the beneficiary of that, as were many of my colleagues here in Calgary. The honors that come, I don't know in terms of the Order of Canada, the process of that one. The Juno, that was a complete surprise. I lost a bet with the person, Allegra Young, who was in charge of Centre Discs at that time, because we were at Mount Allison. There was a festival there, and I was the visiting composer, and she said the Junos nominations are going to come out, and I said, I've never been on any of those things, so I'll be interested in seeing what happens with my colleagues, but that's about it. I had a bet I'd buy her a drink if, in fact, I was on the list.
You ended up buying her that drink.
I ended up buying her a drink, yeah. Yeah. But I went to the ceremony in Winnipeg, and I had not even prepared any kind of acceptance speech, because a week before that I'd heard the Molinari Quartet play the last 6 string quartets by Murray Schafer, and the last of those was the one that was nominated for the Juno on the same thing. It's such a beautiful piece. When I heard it, I was, oh, wow, there we go. There's the Juno. Any fool can hear that. So I went completely expecting to hear his name. Yeah. Or Stephen Chapman, who was also on it, and he'd written a really beautiful piece for that. And it turns out they called my name, and my spouse, Davida, had to give me a nudge. She said, it's you. So I walked up on the stage and invented my acceptance speech as I was walking up. And you get immediately humbled, because as I was speaking, I looked out over the crowd, and 4,000 of my closest rock and roll buddies were all eating their dessert, and they were not listening to me at all. The only people who were listening were the table of CMC, Centre Disc, and other people.
The groupies, the CMC groupies.
Yeah. So you simultaneously felt very honored, but at the same time I recognized the position that we composers have in this particular society that's fundamentally based on qualitative decisions about just about everything, including, unfortunately, music. So those pieces which sell a lot are the ones that people take interest in, and not those things where composers have really sat down and thought about what they're doing and the music that they're creating and how that music, and in many ways they owe to the listener both an experience that they can understand and comprehend, but a music that in some ways is, as I said, transformative and retains a mystery, right? A central mystery. And that central mystery is the thing that drives you back to listen again and again. Yeah, and then the CMC just honored me with Violet Archer Lifetime Achievement Award, and I don't know how that happened, right? It's part of a process that I just got told about, and again, I feel very honored. And in particular, this one touches me deeply because she was a teacher, but she was also a friend. As I got further and further away from graduate school and more into the milieu, Violet Archer accepted me as a colleague. And every time one of my pieces was performed, she'd hear it on the radio. I'd get a telephone call from her, and she would give me a blow-by-blow critique, which is really nice because, for the most part, all you get is the applause and a few people coming up and saying, I really like that, but you don't really know who you've touched. And as Lutoslawski said, we're soul fishing. But for him, as long as he knows that he's touched one person, that's good. That means he's done his job. And so Violet was one of those people for whom I never knew whether I'd actually touched her soul, because she didn't talk that way. She just talked about the musical things that she heard. And she gave me the advice that I should probably lighten up a little bit. Some of the pieces, the early pieces, were very intense. Uh-huh. And so to lighten up is actually not in terms of light entertainment, but to provide that contrast so that if they're going deep or going dark or whatever, that needs to have a balance. Otherwise you haven't done your job.
What is next for you?
I'm immersed right now in the string quartet. The Astralis Quartet is working on a kind of project of doing my string quartet music, and most of that is old. I'm doing pieces from the 90s at this point, and one from 89, which was the Banff String Quartet, RK2, and so I'm immersed in that. And part of what I've done is actually gone back and listened to, of course, the greats, the Haydns and Beethoven, and I've spent a considerable amount of time with Bartók and also with Schaeffer. Murray Schaeffer really rethought about how the string quartet could be. And his last cycle is a very interesting one, and each one of them's a single movement, and each one of them leads to the next one, in the sense that the beginning of the next one, so to speak, takes off where the other one led. So it's a gigantic cycle. They're not really multi-movement works. They are more like the ring cycle, so to speak, for string quartets. Fascinating.
This was wonderful to be in conversation. Thank you so much for sharing so freely of your expertise and your perspectives and life experience. So deeply appreciated.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much. You ask really hard and good questions.
I do ask the hard questions.
Yes, you do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been Musing on CJSW 90.9 FM in Calgary. I'm your host, Janna Sailor. Thank you so much for joining me for the celebration of music, creators, and ideas. Musing is a production of the Canadian Music Centre Prairie Region and is heard right here in Calgary and on all major podcast platforms. As we end our time together, we recognize that there are more than 630 First Nations communities across the lands that we now know of as Canada, representing 50 distinct nations and Indigenous languages. In addition, there are Métis in every province of the country and 53 Inuit communities speaking different dialects of Inuktitut across the north. We acknowledge them as the original music makers, dancers, creators, and caretakers of our lands, and they continue to inspire and teach us as we commit to learning and moving forward together. Until next time, thanks for listening and for supporting Canadian musicians and artists in your community. I will leave you now with more music from Allan Gordon Bell. Take care.